The red warning lights flashed across the massive council chamber as Ambassador Veltar rushed to his seat. He was already 18 hours late to what should have been an emergency meeting. The distress signal had been screaming across space all this time, and still nobody wanted to deal with it. The hologram in the center of the room showed a small mining colony on a distant planet called Kepler 4 Fortubi. It looked peaceful enough from the outside, but Veltar knew better. This place sat right in the middle of what everyone called the graveyard, the most dangerous stretch of space in the known galaxy. "Please, someone has to help us," came the desperate voice through the speakers. It belonged to Nimwell, the colony administrator. Her people, the Milani, were known throughout the galaxy as gentle creatures who wouldn't hurt a fly. They spent their days quietly mining rare crystals and sending them back to help power peaceful worlds. But now they were trapped and dying. "Our life support systems are failing fast," Nimwell continued, her voice shaking with fear. "The meteor shower won't stop. Big rocks keep hitting our shields, and now they're breaking down. We maybe have 3 days of air left, probably less." Veltar studied the tactical display with growing horror. The colony wasn't just in a bad neighborhood, it was in the worst possible place. The graveyard earned its name honestly. Massive asteroids tumbled through space in completely random patterns. Some were as big as cities, others sharp as knives. They moved fast and changed direction without warning because of the weird gravity from a nearby dead star. Even worse, the gravitational fields in that area made normal space navigation almost impossible. Ship computers couldn't plot safe courses when gravity kept shifting and pulling in different directions. It was like trying to drive blindfolded through a tornado while someone threw boulders at your car. Admiral Corex from the Draconis Empire stood up first. His people were known as the toughest warriors in the galaxy, but even he was shaking his head. "I've run the numbers 3 times, he announced. "Any ship that goes in there has a 97% chance of being destroyed. That means out of every 100 ships we send, maybe 3 come back. We can't lose that many vessels to save one small colony." The Zephyrian delegate agreed immediately. Her people built the most advanced spaceships in known space, with computers so smart they could calculate 1 million different flight paths in seconds. But even she looked defeated. "Our navigation systems need at least 2 kilometers of clear space in every direction to work properly. The graveyard barely gives us 30 meters. Our ships would be flying blind." One after another, every major power in the galaxy said no. The Altarians were too cautious. The hegemony claimed it would cost too much. The Trade Federation said it would set a bad precedent. If they saved one colony, they'd have to save them all. Veltar listened to excuse after excuse and felt sick to his stomach. These weren't evil people making these decisions. They were smart, practical leaders who had to think about the bigger picture. Sending rescue ships into the graveyard really was suicide. The math didn't lie, but that didn't make it any easier to listen to Nimwell's increasingly desperate pleas. Echoing through the chamber, her people were going to die, and everyone knew it. As the council session wound down and delegates began filing out, Veltar noticed something odd in the communication logs on his desk. Someone else had requested copies of all the rescue data, complete star charts, colony specifications, the whole package. It was the Terran Federation. Veltar frowned and pulled up what little information the council had on humans. They were newcomers to galactic society, barely 3 years since first contact. Their planet was classified as a Class 12 death world, a place so dangerous that most species couldn't even survive a visit. The council had been polite about letting them join, but privately, most members considered humans to be primitive and reckless. Why would they want information about an impossible rescue mission? Admiral Jack Morrison stared at the spinning hologram of the graveyard asteroid field, and for the first time in weeks, he was smiling. The 3-dimensional display showed thousands of tumbling rocks, each one big enough to crush a spaceship. all moving in completely unpredictable patterns. Most people would look at this and see certain death. Morrison saw the most interesting challenge he'd faced all year. Around the briefing table, his senior officers were leaning forward like kids who'd just been told they could stay up past bedtime. These weren't ordinary military officers. They were the crew of the 3rd Deathworld Fleet. And they had a reputation for taking on missions that made other people wake up screaming. Captain Lisa Hayes commanded the destroyer called the Relentless. She'd once flown her ship so close to a black hole that the gravity stretched her hull by 3 meters, just to rescue a research team that everyone else had written off as dead. Now she was studying the asteroid field like it was a puzzle she couldn't wait to solve. "Hold on," she said, pointing at the display. "You're telling me that every single advanced civilization in the galaxy looked at this and just gave up?" Morrison nodded, still grinning. "That's exactly right, Lisa. The Galactic Council spent exactly 47 minutes debating it before they declared the mission impossible. Their exact words were statistically certain annihilation." Captain Mike Torres burst out laughing. Torres ran the heavy cruiser Indomitable, and he'd earned his reputation by flying through the corona of a star to collect solar plasma samples. The man had literally flown through the surface of the sun and lived to tell about it. "Admiral, no offense to our new galactic neighbors," Torres said, wiping tears from his eyes, "but my 70-year-old grandmother could fly through that asteroid field backwards with her eyes closed. These aliens need to get out more." The other officers around the table were nodding and chuckling. To them, the graveyard didn't look like a death trap. It looked like a slightly more interesting version of their usual Tuesday morning flight exercises. Morrison turned to Commander Beth Jackson, his tactical officer and the person responsible for making sure they're impossible. Missions stayed merely dangerous instead of actually suicidal. Beth had calculated flight paths through neutron, star debris fields, and mapped safe routes through collapsing wormholes. She was probably the smartest person in the room, which was saying something. "Commander, how fast can we get the 3rd Fleet ready to launch?" Beth was already pulling up deployment schedules on her tablet, her fingers flying across the screen. "Sir, we can have all ships fueled, armed, and ready to jump in for hours." The fleet was specifically designed for neutron star operations and black hole rescue missions. "Honestly, this asteroid field will be good practice for the rookies." The room buzzed with excited conversation as officers started making plans. Someone mentioned bringing extra hull repair patches. Another person suggested packing additional medical supplies for the rescued colonists. A few of the younger officers were actually arguing over who got to fly point position through the most dangerous sections. These were people who regularly operated in stellar coronas hot enough to melt entire planets. They flew rescue missions into black hole event horizons, where space and time got twisted into impossible shapes. They'd pulled survey teams out of exploding stars and evacuated research stations from the path of gamma-ray bursts. To the 3rd Deathworld Fleet, the graveyard wasn't a terrifying obstacle course of death. It was just another day at the office, maybe a slightly more interesting day than usual, but nothing they hadn't handled before. Morrison stood up, his decision made, signaled the Galactic Council immediately. "Tell them the Terran Federation formally accepts the rescue mission for Kepler-4, 42b. He paused and looked around the room at his officers. These crazy humans who thought flying through asteroid fields was entertainment. "And Beth, make sure we pack plenty of those new emergency hull patches. Something tells me we're going to put on quite a show for our galactic neighbors." The room erupted in cheers and excited planning. Within minutes, the 3rd Deathworld Fleet was preparing to do what the entire rest of the galaxy considered absolutely impossible. They couldn't wait to get started. Captain Lisa Hayes felt her ship shake as 2 house-sized asteroids tumbled past on either side of the Relentless. The rocky surfaces were so close she could have reached out and touched them if the hull hadn't been in the way. Her knuckles were white as she gripped the armrests of her command chair, but not from fear, from pure excitement. "You know what?" she called out to her bridge crew, her voice filled with genuine joy. "This is actually the most fun I've had all month." Her officers just nodded and kept working. After 3 years of serving under Captain Hayes, they'd learned not to question what she considered entertainment. This was the same woman who'd once described flying through a solar flare as better than a roller coaster. The entire third Deathworld fleet was cutting through the graveyard like it was a Sunday afternoon cruise, while other galactic civilizations would have spent weeks plotting every single move with supercomputers. The humans were making it up as they went along. They relied on gut instinct, lightning-fast reflexes, and the occasional creative use of explosives. Hayes watched her tactical display as the fleet spread out into a loose formation. Each ship was taking a slightly different path through the asteroid maze, but somehow they all kept moving in the same general direction. It looked chaotic from the outside, but there was a method to the madness. Admiral Morrison's voice crackled through the communication system from the flagship Defiant. "Torres, are you seeing that spinning cluster of rocks at bearing 27 Mark IV? Captain Mike Torres was piloting the heavy cruiser Indomitable through a particularly dense section of the field. His response came back immediately. "You mean the one that's spinning around like a giant blender made of death?" "Yeah, I see it, Admiral." Hard to miss something that ugly. Morrison's voice carried that tone that Torres had learned to recognize over their 15-year friendship. It meant the Admiral was about to suggest something that was either completely brilliant or absolutely insane. Usually both. "Think you can bounce a torpedo off the big asteroid to clear us a path through there?" Torres was quiet for exactly 2 seconds, while he calculated angles, velocities, and the approximately 17 different ways this could go horribly wrong. Then he laughed. "Sir, that's either the most brilliant tactical move I've ever heard, or the most completely insane thing you've ever asked me to do." Morrison's reply came back immediately. "Torres, you've known me for 15 years. When have I ever had a brilliant idea?" Torres fired the torpedo without another word. The warhead struck the largest asteroid at precisely the right angle, and with exactly the right amount of force. The explosion sent smaller chunks of rock flying in a perfect pattern that opened up a clear corridor through the spinning cluster. It was like playing the galaxy's most dangerous game of pool, and Torres had just made an impossible shot. Across the galaxy, monitoring stations were tracking the human fleet's progress with growing amazement. Advanced alien computers had calculated that navigating the graveyard would take at least 3 weeks using the safest possible routes. The humans were doing it in 3 hours using routes that most civilizations would consider mathematically impossible. Captain Dave Wilson was having the time of his life aboard the supply ship Endurance. His vessel was packed with emergency medical supplies, food, and rescue equipment for the trapped colonists. Most supply ship captains would be terrified flying through an asteroid field, but Wilson was actually humming an old Earth song while he surfed the gravitational waves between asteroid clusters. The weird gravity fields that made this area so dangerous for other species were like playground equipment to Wilson. He rode the invisible waves of gravitational force, using them to slingshot his heavily loaded ship through gaps that should have been too narrow. Every few minutes, he'd hit a particularly good gravitational wave, and his ship would dance between the asteroids like it was weightless. Lieutenant Amy Foster, the communications officer on the Relentless, looked up from her console with excitement in her voice. "Captain, the colony's distress signal is getting much stronger. We're definitely getting close." Hayes felt her heart rate pick up. They were almost there. The rescue mission that every other civilization in the galaxy had declared impossible was about to become reality, and they'd done it in record time while having the time of their lives. When the third Deathworld fleet finally reached Kepler 442b, Admiral Morrison felt his stomach drop. The distress signal hadn't told them the whole story. What they found was much worse than anyone had imagined. the mining colony's main habitat. Dome looked like it had been used for target practice by an angry giant. 17 major cracks ran across its surface like spider webs, and precious atmosphere was streaming out into space, invisible jets of frozen gas. Even as they watched, more meteors kept slamming into the structure, making the cracks worse with every impact. Morrison stood on the bridge of the Defiant, studying the tactical display with growing concern. The colony was dying right in front of them, and conventional rescue procedures would kill everyone inside before they could save a single person. "Give me options, people," Morrison demanded, his voice tight with urgency. Commander Beth Jackson was running calculations on her computer, and none of them were good news. "Sir, any standard docking procedure will cause catastrophic decompression. The moment we attach to their airlock, the pressure difference will blow out those cracks completely. The colonists will be dead before we can establish a proper seal, Captain." Lisa Hayes had been staring at the colony's structure for several minutes, her mind working through possibilities that would make most people break out in cold sweats. Finally, she looked up with that expression Morrison had learned to both love and fear. "Admiral, what if we completely forget about conventional docking?" Morrison raised an eyebrow. "Explain that, Captain." Hayes pointed at the tactical display, specifically at the massive bulk of the Defiant. "What if we ram our ship directly into the asteroid? We could use our armored hull as a temporary atmospheric seal while we evacuate everyone through the breach we create." The bridge fell completely silent. Even by human standards, this was an insane plan. Hayes was suggesting they turn their flagship into a giant cork to plug the hole in a dying space station. It was the kind of idea that could only come from a species that regularly confused calculated risk with barely controlled disaster. Morrison didn't hesitate for even a second. "Do it." The Defiant's engines roared to life as Morrison personally took control of the ship. He aimed the armored prow directly at the weakest section of the asteroid, calculating impact force and trajectory in his head. Too little force, and they wouldn't break through. Too much, and they'd crush the very people they were trying to save. The ship struck with perfectly calculated violence. The Defiant's reinforced nose punched through solid rock and twisted metal like it was made of paper, creating an emergency airlock sealed by several thousand tons of Earth-built spacecraft. The impact shook both vessels, but it worked. Atmosphere stopped venting from the colony. Before the dust had even settled, Marines in powered armor were already moving. They launched themselves into space through the ongoing meteor bombardment like they were taking a casual stroll through a park. These were people who'd trained for combat in every hostile environment imaginable, and a little falling debris wasn't going to slow them down. Sergeant Tom Bradley led his squad through chunks of rock that would have sent any sane person running for cover. A piece of asteroid the size of a car tumbled past his helmet, close enough to see the mineral veins in the surface. "Just another Tuesday," he muttered to himself as he helped a terrified Milani child into an emergency evacuation suit. The kid was shaking with fear, but Bradley's calm confidence helped steady the little alien's nerves. All around the colony, similar scenes were playing out. Human Marines moved through the damaged habitat like they'd done this 1,000 times before, carefully but quickly evacuating colonists who had given up all hope of survival. They carried the injured, guided the scared, and somehow managed to keep everyone calm in the middle of what should have been absolute chaos. The Milani colonists couldn't believe what they were seeing. These strange aliens from the death world called Earth were risking their lives for people they'd never met, in conditions that had scared off every other civilization in the galaxy. 2 hours later, it was over. All 847 colonists were safely aboard the human vessels, breathing recycled air and wrapped in emergency blankets. The Defiant looked like it had been through a blender. Her hull was cracked. Her nose was buried in an asteroid, and she was held together mostly by emergency. patches and stubborn determination. But every single alien was alive, and that was all that mattered to the humans. The third Deathworld fleet's return journey to Galactic Council space was a sight that would be talked about for generations. The human ships looked like they'd been fed through a giant meat grinder, and somehow kept flying anyway. The Defiant's nose was completely crushed from ramming into an asteroid, held together by emergency welds that glowed cherry red in the darkness of space. The Relentless had 17 separate holes punched through her hull, each one patched with whatever materials the crew could find. The Indomitable was missing 2 entire deck sections that had been torn away by spinning debris. Any other fleet would have been considered a total loss. Most civilizations would have held memorial services and written off the crews as heroic casualties. But the human ships kept flying, their engines humming steadily, their crews joking over the radio about who had taken the most damage. More importantly, every single one of the 847 Milani colonists was alive and safe aboard the battered vessels. The news reached the Galactic Council chambers faster than the fleet itself. Emergency sessions were called on dozens of worlds, as government leaders tried to understand what had just happened. The mathematics hadn't changed. The graveyard was still just as deadly as before. But somehow, impossibly, the humans had made it look easy. Ambassador Veltar found himself watching the mission recordings for what must have been the 100th time. He kept replaying the same moments over and over, trying to understand how the humans had done what every computer model said was impossible. They treated the entire mission like it was a training exercise. He reported to the Altarian High Command during an emergency briefing. I monitored their communications throughout the operation. These people were actually enjoying themselves. He pulled up a specific recording that still made him shake his head in disbelief. When Captain Hayes was asked about the risk assessment after the mission, she said, and I quote exactly, "What risk?" It was just flying through some rocks. She genuinely didn't understand why anyone thought it was dangerous. But what really disturbed the galactic leaders was what came next in the recordings. Admiral Morrison was already planning modifications for next time, discussing how they could improve their response. Apparently, taking 4 hours to deploy was too slow for future rescue operations. They wanted to cut it down to 2 hours. The Dracona's military attaché looked visibly shaken as he addressed his own war council. They're not celebrating their success. They're discussing improvements, as if this was merely their baseline expectation. As if missions like this should be routine. The attitude was completely alien to every other species in the galaxy, where others saw a miraculous one-time achievement that defied all logic. The humans saw room for improvement, and a job that could be done better next time. Colony Administrator Nimwell was given the honor of addressing the full Galactic Council personally. Her testimony would become one of the most important speeches in galactic history. The humans asked for nothing in return. She told the assembled delegates, her voice still filled with wonder. When I tried to discuss payment or compensation, Admiral Morrison looked confused. He told me that helping people who couldn't help themselves was just what you do. His exact words were no big deal. She paused, looking around at the representatives of dozens of advanced civilizations. They risked everything for strangers they had never met, from a species they barely knew existed, and they acted like this was the most normal thing in the universe. The implications hit the galactic community like a shockwave. Every major power suddenly realized they had been thinking about rescue operations completely wrong. What they considered impossible suicide missions. These newcomers from Earth considered basic moral obligations. Within a single week, every major galactic power had submitted formal alliance requests to the Terran Federation. The Altarian Republic wanted mutual defense agreements. The Draconis Empire requested joint military training exercises. Even the cautious Cepharian Collective was asking for technology exchanges and cultural programs. The humans, characteristically, seemed surprised by all the attention. When asked about their heroic rescue mission, They kept saying things like we just did what anyone would do, and it wasn't that hard once you got used to it. The age of careful, calculated galactic civilization was ending. A new era was beginning. One influenced by the human philosophy of hold my beer and watch this diplomacy. And somehow, despite all logic and reason, the universe was about to become a much safer place. Because now everyone knew that when the impossible needed to be done, you called the humans. They'd show up with damaged ships, crazy plans, and absolutely no sense of self-preservation. And they'd get the job done while making it look easy.